What this tells me is that Europe writ large has ceased functioning completely as what we would consider a normal economy. Consumption has collapsed across the entire Union, which means they have kind of a South Korea demographic structure, and they have to export to make things work. Europe, the EU in general, cannot survive in a world without easy access to consumption-based markets, which means that the United States was edging towards a trade war with the European Union, regardless of who won our elections back in November. Now, for you guys specifically, the big sticking point is something called the Common Agricultural Program, which is basically a subsidy regime in order to keep farmers on the land. It's been a sticking point when trade negotiations with the United States for quite literally decades, and Spain in particular is the number 3 recipient of CAP funds. For citrus specifically, it comes out to $100 million per year. Spanish citrus is also wildly dependent on being able to sell to the rest of the European Union writ large, which requires the Union to be intertangled, intermeshed, under treaty law, and having someone to export to. So all the changes that we are seeing in the global environment are deadly to the European Union in its current form. And whether they decide to cut the cap in order to have a little bit extra cash to throw around, or the common market just fractures under the pressure, it really doesn't matter. Any possible path from this point forward is very, very bad for agriculture in Spain in general. And they certainly don't have the capacity to make it work without external support from the rest of Europe. So whether or not there's a trade war or a trade deal with the United States, it doesn't matter, because support for citrus will go away. We'll close out with a few thoughts here. First of all, give you an idea of things to look for moving forward. First of all, we have our first stimulus package coming out of the Biden administration. It's in front of the Senate right now. It'll probably go back to the House within a few days for approval. It will certainly be implemented before the end of this month. And nor is this the end of it. There'll probably be a second supplementary package later in the first half of the year. So just get ready for that money to be coming in. If you haven't already reached out for a little of assistance from your lobbyists, now would be a great time. Second, the Russians and the Americans are butting heads in a very big way. We are opposed on energy policy. We are opposed on human rights policy, democracy, cyber theft, you name it. And the big change from the Biden administration compared to the last 12 years is that we're not exposed anymore. It used to be that the United States refrained from doing anything too direct against the Russians, because we were wrapped up in NATO and we didn't want a nuclear war. We were wrapped up in energy markets and we didn't want to trigger any sort of global catastrophe. Well, that's not the case anymore. Under Trump, we basically removed ourselves from NATO. So you can have strategic blowback from the Russians that doesn't hit the United States. And the shale revolution has run its course, and we are now net energy independent, which means that if you have an energy shock that's Russian triggered, it doesn't affect us. So expect the Biden administration to throw all kinds of sanctions on the Russians for all kinds of things, and to specifically target the energy sector. And that will crush the prospects for a lot of countries around the world, but really have no impact on North America. Speaking of energy, let's talk about Iran. The Iranians are facing a lot of problems right now. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign succeeded in shattering the Iranian economic system. They really can't export much crude anymore. And without the money that comes from those crude sales, they have a hard time supporting their paramilitary groups throughout the broader region. So the overall Iranian strategic picture is the worst that it's been in 40 years. In that environment, the Biden administration would like to have a new nuclear deal, but they don't just want to dust off the old one. They want to start over and get a new deal with better terms that reflects the strategic changes. Iran, of course, thinks that's an awful idea. And so they've started trying to get leverage over the United States. The problem is they don't have any, and they really can't get any. Around New Year's, the Iranians went out and hijacked a South Korean chemicals tanker in an effort to get some political chips that they could trade away. Trump did nothing. Biden did nothing. We just don't care. which means that the Iranians don't really have much choice but to try to amp it up and grab bigger ships. But that's a problem for everyone else, not for us. The country that would face the biggest problem from that is the world's largest oil importer, China, a country that lacks the military capacity to get to this region in the first place. Fourth, this is Katherine Tai. She's the U.S. Trade Representative. If you don't know her now, get to know her very well. By some measures, she's wildly underqualified for the job. The Trade Representative is responsible for negotiating every trade deal we have. Tai has never led a trade deal. She's never even managed a large bureaucracy. So she really is coming in with no experience. But honestly, that tells me everything I need to know about the Biden administration's trade policy. There really isn't one in the traditional sense. With the possible exception of the United Kingdom, we're not even considering having a new deal with anyone in the United States. What Katherine Tai is a trade litigation lawyer. She sues countries who violate the spirit and the letter of American trade law. We're going to sue everybody. Now, if you want Katherine Tai to sue someone on your behalf, try to get as far up on her list as you possibly can. She's going to be a very busy beaver because the U.S. thinks everyone violates the letter and the spirit of American trade law. So it's just a question of who gets in first. Fifth, the Biden administration has said all the right things about Europe and re-engaging with the world, but the Biden administration has also made it very clear that it expects America to be back and leading the world, but it's going to do so without any money and any troops. Yeah, that's not how that works. In reality, the Biden administration is actually very hostile to Europe in particular, because under Barack Obama, the United States asked the Europeans for two things: troops for Afghanistan and stimulus spending to help recover from the 2007 crisis. Europe gave nothing. Biden remembers that. And so I expect relations with the Europeans to take a very dark turn very early in the Biden's term, certainly this year. And by the time we get to the second half where the US economy is recovering, but Europe's not, expect that trade war. And then finally, China. Things are going bad on both sides of the relationship. On the Chinese side, we've seen that what economic growth they had last year wasn't from consumption, and it really wasn't from exports. It was from inventory build. It's very Enron. I mean, we've seen this movie before. Asia in 1997, 1998, that big crisis, had the same sort of start. The Chinese demography is sharply terminal. The Chinese Politburo knows that their economic model is collapsing. And so they're closing ranks, they're demonizing outsiders, and they are trying to enact a broad-scale political purge in preparation for a broad-scale lockdown. They know they face an economic challenge and maybe even an economic collapse. So going into a dictatorial political system is their way of holding the center. Will it work? Too soon to tell. But if you're from the outside world and you have an economic relationship with the People's Republic, it's time to get out. And that's just that side. On our side, Donald Trump threw a couple of grenades into the relationship on his way out the door. One, he called what was going on in the western province of Zhejiang a genocide because it's a genocide. And second, he said that any American bureaucrat or diplomat could go to Taiwan at any time in their official capacity as an American representative, which is like that far from formal recognition because, Taiwan is an independent state. The Biden administration also doubled down on every tariff and every sanction that Donald Trump